Hi, I'm Michael, your host. Welcome to The Journey. Today we're going to be talking about WSAVA food guidelines. There's been a new update. What did they miss? What did they include? What should we know? And who should we ask? Today we're going to be visiting with Nicole Kamamak, and she's been with us several times talking and breaking down the pet food industry, what's going on, what's really going on, and what to be aware of. So with that, I would like to say welcome everyone to our room today, and let's sit back, enjoy our conversation. Nicole, welcome. It's so nice to see you. Let's dive into it. So WSAVA.
Yep. World Small Animal Veterinary Association.
And how long have they been around?
Oof. That's actually a good question. I'm not entirely sure. I can look it up when I get settled in my office here. But it's a long while for sure. At least a couple of decades. I would be surprised if it's much longer than that.
And so it's a global committee, right?
It is. Yes, it's veterinarians from all over the world. They advise and put out policy, if you will, on a variety of different subjects, not just nutrition. They do everything from, medical care, animal welfare, a variety of different topics in relation to veterinary medicine.
Yeah, I noticed because they, like you're saying, they do anything from pain to nutrition to vaccination. So yeah, they have their hands in everything. It's nice. So where do we start with this conversation? That's what I want to know with you. Where do we start? Because I've been looking at all these different documents, reading what you put together that you sent me, and it's just every bit of it is an explosive little message. So where do we start?
Yeah. So, I'll be honest up front, I'm not by any stretch an expert on everything that WSAVA covers. I am intimately familiar with, their nutrition guidance, if you will, the strengths, the weaknesses, the gaps. So I think, at least from, my corner, it was not something that everyone else was largely aware of or talked about up until the whole DCM grain-free debacle. Now we're actually at the 3-year mark of that. So it was just something that I would say largely people were not aware of. The veterinary community, I would say even awareness to their nutrition information has definitely become more prevalent in the last 3 years because they say, nutrition is a part of the patient assessment, if you will. So I think what it got boiled down to, right, because everybody wants a simple, succinct answer. And, I think from talking to me and others that when it comes to medicine and nutrition, that isn't always possible. So I think what you ended up seeing as a result of the DCM debacle is the message get boiled down to feed only WSAVA approved or WSAVA recommended foods. And the fact of the matter is, and WSAVA will tell you this, and they actually just did it in a webinar that I took on Thursday directly from them, is that they do not approve or recommend or endorse foods. What becomes really difficult is that if you actually go to their website, or even there's a couple blogs on pet food industry, it's very apparent that they are sponsored quite generously by large name pet food companies. And so part of the scandal, if you will, is that the original WSAVA recommendations that were around up until earlier this year essentially were set up so that only their sponsors were fitting their recommendations, right? They were fitting into that kind of that little box that WSAVA put out. What became really interesting is the new information from WSAVA. They're no longer recommendations; they're guidelines, and those are actually two very different things, which I'll get to in a second. What's really interesting is that there are only 2 outward pet food companies that actually meet the new guidelines, and all of the WSAVA sponsors, if you will, are actually non-compliant, which is really interesting. It's quite the turn of conversation, if you will.
Yeah, because it's given them the possibility just to skirt by once again.
Well, I think so. I'm involved in a couple of nutrition groups on Facebook that I don't really participate in them, but I do kind of lurk and listen to it. A lot of people are saying that these new guidelines are soft and that they're bare minimum, and that's actually not the case. These new guidelines are actually quite a significant what the old recommendations were, and that the reason why a lot of the big name pet food companies like your Hills and your Royal Canines, your Purinas are actually not compliant is because these new guidelines are asking for, or at least pointing veterinarians and consumers to ask specific questions that, I know from being in industry, and I know a lot of people that are in the audience know these companies actually don't meet. So, and what I mean by that is specifically is that they will not provide you a full nutrient analysis, a typical nutrient analysis analyzed from the final product. They will not provide you with a full digestibility report. Sometimes they will provide it to the veterinarian, but it's a lot of extra work in the veterinarian. And, we know that veterinarians have enough on their plate. They're overworked. They're tired. They're busy. They just don't have the capacity to do that, right? So what the argument is that these companies, all pet food companies, should be making basic nutrition information available to the public, and that includes that typical analysis and that digestibility.
So, are we liking WSAVA WSAVA now?
I think that they've stepped up for sure. I think there's room for improvement. There always is room for improvement, right? It's definitely a step in the right direction. I think that they mean well. I think that the problem is that some of the people that represent WSAVA or lean very heavily toward their recommendations don't entirely understand what they mean. And so it really boils down to the fact that we need to educate the consumer. We need to educate the veterinarian, the retailer, all the people that kind of play in the space to understand what some of these technical terms mean, as well as what all of these pet food companies do. It's kind of those 5 things that a lot of us always talk about, in evaluating a pet food company. Are they doing their due diligence? Do they have somebody that is truly qualified to formulate food? Are they doing their homework by testing the final product? Are they doing digestibility studies? Do they have proper food safety procedures in place? And do they outbound test their final product? Or in other words, we call it a positive release program. There's a few other things that are important as well, but those are really the 5 majors. And, like I said, a lot of companies are not doing one or more of those things.
And yet they are able to continue to produce food.
Yeah, there's a, and I know we've talked about this before, there's a very, very low bar to entry into the pet food marketplace. All you have to do is formulate a food to meet minimum requirements set by AFCO, and you're good to go.
And so WSAVA, are they a profit or non-for-profit?
I believe they're not for profit. It's more of a representative body for the veterinary industry, if you will. And like I said, I'm not very well versed on all of the other things that they do. Like you had mentioned, like vaccinations and things like that. Where my knowledge is with them really lies in the nutrition space.
And so have they been on your radar since the day you got into nutrition?
Yeah, I would maybe not the day, but yeah, for sure. It's something that we've always had a pulse on, if you will. But like I said, the conversation surrounding WSAVA and what their recommendations / guidelines were really became more popular or well known with the DCM incident. Like I said, now starting about 3 years ago.
And so is that what prompted, you sent me this paperwork with Ryan's name on it, your name on it. How long ago did you guys write this? Is this new?
Which one are you talking about?
The questions asked your pet food company?
Oh, yeah. So that's been around. We have different versions of that have been around for give or take. I'm sure his far outdate mine, but I have mine date back to at least about 2 years ago. I know that, just from reading his work in industry and, knowing his work very well in industry, his tone, if you will, on that subject hasn't changed ever. He's always advocated for those things. I think it's just more recently you're seeing it in a more digestible consumer-facing format.
Well, learning so much from you guys. So let's get back to WSAVA and the pet food companies that are getting away with it. You said that, one thing you said is that they're getting so much sponsorship by these bigger companies so that they're not really paying attention to these companies when it comes to them meeting the guidelines. Is that what I'm getting?
Yeah. So the old recommendations, if you will, they had a series of questions that pointed veterinarians or consumers to, major pet food brands. And, not to say if there's anything wrong with that. Everybody has their own feeding philosophy. And, they have certain things that are important to them or to their pet. And, I wholeheartedly respect that. I think that, based on, what we know and how we evaluate pet food, as well as, I think most importantly, especially this day and age, food safety, those guidelines were just in need of a major update, if you will. And so what happened, I want to say third quarter last year, Dr. Yamko wrote a article for pet food industry, and it was called WSAVA Guidelines, Useful or Useless. And in that article, he pointed out several weaknesses in the WSAVA recommendations and also provided several opportunities for them to update. And so what you see now in the updated recommendations is they actually took a lot of his advice and a lot of his recommendations for updating those. And effectively, and I don't think they realized this, but what they did, as I mentioned earlier, is they made a lot of those major pet food companies' foods effectively non-compliant. While some formulations are compliant, the majority of them are not. And it's simply because they're not doing a final nutrient analysis and digestibility study, which the new recommendations do ask for, at least a nutrient analysis. They're actually not asking for digestibility yet, but they are asking for nutrient analysis, which a lot of these companies just don't take the time to do. So that's the major reason why most of them are non-compliant. Another reason would be that they don't freely hand out the information that they have available. Like I mentioned earlier, consumer largely will not be given that information. And veterinarians too, they're not given open access to it. They have to ask for it. And even then, since a lot of the veterinarians I know, when we've reached out to these companies to ask them, they give an abbreviated version that's not a full nutrient analysis. And so if you're a veterinarian and you have a patient that say needs low copper or low phosphorus, or maybe you have some sort of amino acid issue and you want to address that, you sometimes have access to all of that information, or maybe they'll give you specific named nutrients, but they won't give you a full nutrient analysis. And so that's a problem, especially when, these larger veterinary organizations, if you will, are promoting veterinarians as the source for nutrition recommendations and information, but then they're not arming veterinarians with all of the information that they need. So it's kind of like this tangled web of misinformation or just bad information. And, like I said, these guidelines hopefully will force some pet food companies to be a little bit more transparent, but I still think there's a lot of room for improvement.
Well, I mean, there's two things that you mentioned. So first, the big companies, what I understand you saying is that the big companies are really not being compliant because maybe just 2 tests and they're just too lazy to do these last 2 tests, to do these reports analysis. And these tests, I would assume, aren't that expensive.
No, they're not. So, give or take, and there's, different laboratories and different kennels throughout. I'm speaking just solely for the U.S. Obviously things can be a little bit different in other countries, but in the U.S., what you typically will find is to analyze a final formula and do a digestibility study. You'll look at about $6,000. That's a lot of money to an individual person. Obviously, it's a lot of money to you or to me. But for a pet food company, especially some of these ones that spend so much money on marketing, or just simply I'll even point out social media budgets for some of these companies. It's not a lot of money, and they put so much marketing effort into, designing their bag, designing retailer handouts, designing consumer-facing information, designing their web pages. These are things that I think as well as I do, cost a ton of money, and they can't simply put aside $6,000. Or they'll say, well, we can't afford it, or, we're a little company. And, the answer that usually we give to that is, well, then you shouldn't be bringing that food to market, because if you're not validating that product, effectively what you're doing is you're testing on my animal or my client's animal. And that's a problem. We see different things pop up, throughout the years. If you kind of look back, you see the megaesophagus issue that's happened throughout Australia more than one time. You see vitamin D issues. You see thyroid hormone issues. There's a variety of things that can happen. And as we know now, which I think is absolutely fascinating, there's a couple of organizations, not just one, that's going around testing different raw foods, for example. And I know that there are some that are doing kibbles. And what they're doing is just seeing if these formulas meet minimal nutritional guidelines. And I will tell you, because I've seen the data from all of these, at least that I know of, that are going on. And I don't think a lot of it's published yet, but I've seen most of these data sets. And I can tell you that not one formula that has been tested so far meets minimal nutritional requirements, or they're over in others that could potentially be dangerous, like, for example, calcium and phosphorus.
That's frightening.
It's very frightening.
Yeah.
And that's the exact reason why it's so important for these companies to do their due diligence. For them to say, we don't have the time or the money, is an absolute load of BS.
And it seems like such a simple thing the way you describe it in the mechanics of everything. Then when I think about it, it seems like such a simple thing for them to do. Because for us, we get our product always tested, third-party tested and all that. And it's just packaging it up, sending it away, send it to a lab. They come back with their analysis. We post them. We're great. But
yep.
And that's pretty simple. And I would think that's with any lab around.
I think
go on.
One of the big issues is that most people don't ask. And I see Diana down there, and I think she will agree with me. Diana asks. I know she does. I ask. I know that there are other retailers around that ask. I think it boils down to the retailers that don't just say, well, they always say no, or they say they can't, and they feel like they have nowhere else to go, so they don't ask. The other thing that happens is consumers run into an even worse issue, right? Where they feel like they just get pushback from the company and they don't understand some of this terminology and lingo, as well as these companies are super crafty at making you think that they know what they're doing, or that they are fulfilling the answers to the questions that you're asking. And Diane actually had a great example yesterday she sent me. Sorry, I hope I'm not throwing you under the bus, but I'll take the heat for it. It's from Acana, which is Champion Pet Food. And they emailed and they said, we have a new food and it's greater than 80% digestibility. And so it's awesome and you should sell my food. And 80% digestibility is pretty awful. You really want to see 90 or better, or at least 88% or better. 80% digestibility could potentially cause some major nutritional deficiencies, or I would argue that you're going to see things like DCM pop up with an 80% digestibility, because that tells me that there's way too much fiber in the food and the body's going to be excreting taurine. So I think that it really boils down to you need to ask the question. I don't care if you're a consumer. I don't care if you're a retailer or a veterinarian. These companies need to hear people ask the question, because if they feel that the consumers or the retailers don't care enough, or they're not asking for it, they really have no reason to do it.
Yeah. And I will say that I'm absolutely astonished at how few of the retailers seem to be very concerned about it. And that's concerning, because I don't think they're looking at the big picture of the liability issues for us as retailers either. Because because here, and I will tell you my personal story is, I had a customer's dog that was poisoned and killed by pentobarbital in a canned product. She hadn't bought that can from my store. It was another store, but I carried that product and was, the person that told her it was a great food. And, here I am, thankfully, she did not blame me for the death of her animal, but I was very, very fortunate there. Had she, been mad and blamed me for the death of her dog and decided to sue me, I just defending a lawsuit, whether I won or not, isn't the point. It could have absolutely destroyed the business. But not only that, it could have destroyed my reputation that I have spent years building up. And, they don't see that. They just see, hey, they come in and they, put a food on my shelf and I sell the food and I tell everybody it's great. But, for me, it's not just the selling the food or the monetary, it's the horrible sense of guilt that I still feel over that. And it was because I didn't ask the right questions. And I'm on a crusade, to try to get everybody to help us out, help us push these manufacturers. Because if WSAVA's guidelines kind of act as a push from the top, then we sure as hell can act like another push from the bottom. And we're going to squeeze them right in the middle, and eventually, hopefully, we'll get some results.
And that's a really good point, Diana. And I think that's something, as a pet owner for you in the audience, if nothing else, take away from this, the good parts about this WSAVA update is it allows you, your veterinarian, and us as nutritionists and or retailers to really push the manufacturers to say, hey, listen, this stuff is important, and these are the reasons why. And the fact that we now have, and I will say, a reputable organization pushing for things like that, it's certainly a step in the right direction, for sure.
Well, I had a question earlier that I was going to ask you, Nicole, backing up a little bit. When we're talking about the big company like Hills, Purina, and all these, they do a lot of white labeling for other companies. So isn't it just easy that they get it tested and then they get past that test on to the white labeled companies?
Well, so it's more of the third-party manufacturers. So your third-party manufacturers are doing those multiple brands, if you will. So great examples for people in the audience, easily recognizable, I should say. Diamond Pet Foods. Diamond Pet Foods makes Taste of the Wild. Everybody knows Taste of the Wild. Taste of the Wild, or I should say Diamond Pet Foods, is also for Health from Tractor Supply. They're also Kirkland from Costco. Back in the day, prior to their massive recall, they also did Chicken Soup for the Soul. They did Well Pet, which is wellness. They did a variety of foods, if you will. So Tuffy's is another good example. So Nutrisource is Tuffy's. They also manufacture a variety of other brands under their roof. So those companies have nutritionists on staff. Some of them well qualified and experienced, some of them not. But I don't care who makes the food. I don't care if you own your own facility and make your own food. I don't care if you own the company and it's made by Simmons or Tuffy's or whoever. You should, and it's irrelevant what facility it comes out of, you should be having those tests done. You should have a final nutrient analysis. You should have a digestibility report. You should have a variety of food safety programs in place, and you should have testing before you leave that facility, not only for pathogens, but also for things like heavy metals and fertilizers and melamine and all of the things that have plagued us in the past. So I would say, there are some, and it's unfortunate because a lot of them are the veterinary nutritionists that kind of tout WSAVA. And so the irony is that they don't realize how many of these companies actually have their food made by a third party. But I argue that it's irrelevant because it's, like I said, if the food safety and the just due diligence policies are in place, then it doesn't matter.
Well, and if I could jump in here too, the problem with a lot of the third-party manufacturing or co-packing is the fact that, for example, I just did a study over the last 4 years. 125 recalls have been put through the veterinary page on the FDA. 72% of those were for pet food, dog and cat food. Okay, for aflatoxin, different toxins in the food, pentobarbital, things like that. And that goes to show you, that already this year, we've had like 8 recalls already. And one company, this is their 6th recall within less than a year. But see, the thing is nobody knows Sunshine Mills. They know Sport Blend or whatever the heck that thing is that they manufacture. So if they see Sunshine Mill recall, they're not going to know that it's their pet food that actually has been recalled as part of that, unless they're extremely lucky. If they go back into the store, hopefully the store will have posted notices, but they could continue to feed that food and kill their animal and never know why that animal died.
Well, and to your point, and Michael, you probably remember this. So the Diamond Pet Food recall, that it was known as that, the Diamond Pet Food recall. There are still people to this day that have no idea it was Taste of the Wild and Chicken Soup and Wild Pet and all of these other brands that were underneath that roof. And at the end of the day, it wasn't necessarily that every single one of those formulas was impacted, although there was, I believe, over 100. And there might be more. Diana, you might remember the numbers a little bit better than I do. But at the end of the day, the reason why so many of those formulas were impacted, and I will say the same thing about Midwestern Pet, which is Earthborn, ProPack, Sport Mix, those guys, is because those 2 companies did not have adequate food safety policy and procedure in place. So what happened when, in both of those instances, when they figured out it was a salmonella/aflatoxin issue, is the FDA and the authorities went to those facilities and they said, okay, well, show me all of your documentation that shows me, how you stored this product, what time frame it was made, on what machinery, that you cleaned that machinery, that you had a test and hold. And in both instances, and I shouldn't say this for Midwestern, but I think all the writing is on the wall. So I will say allegedly for Midwestern. But this definitely happened for Diamond and, the Taste of the Wild group, is they didn't have those documentation and procedures in place and they weren't following their own quality control procedures. So then what the FDA says is, okay, you have to recall everything and you have to do it by 5 p.m. this evening. And if you don't, we will issue an advisory. And so what these companies end up having happen is they're forced into a voluntary recall. And so to the consumer and the veterinarian, it looks as if they caught it themselves when that's not at all what happened. So when you start to see multiple dozens, hundreds, or in these cases, thousands of lot numbers recalled, that tells you that there is a pervasive food safety and cultural problem at that particular manufacturer.
Well, and two, I'll also say that the FDA, once they complete their initial investigation into this, find the problem or the problems reported to them, whatever, they don't close that case out until the issue's been resolved. Unless I'm wrong, Nikki, and you can,
you're
correct me.
You're correct.
Yeah.
And
so I went back and looked at the recall for my customers, issue. It was indeed closed out simply because it was co-packed by a different canning company and they moved it to another canning company. But the original canning company's recall is still open, and that was in 2018. Yep. They have yet to close that case. They've also yet to close the case on the Science Diet vitamin D, the Hill's vitamin D. That is still not closed.
The reason why that's not closed is because the reason why that vitamin D recall happened, and there was, again, hundreds of lot numbers impacted, as well as, we believe, globally, thousands of dogs that were sickened or killed. And this is actually really interesting when it comes to WSAVA, because it ties in beautifully. That reason why that's not closed is because Hill said, well, as a result of this recall, we have XYZ policy procedure in place. And that procedure was that they were supposed to be inbound testing their raw ingredients, so in this case, vitamin D, to make sure that it was at the level that the manufacturer said that it was. So Hills did not do that. And so that vitamin D supplement, if you will, made it into obviously a variety of different formulas at a well above the allowable level. And so the FDA said, well, yeah, you have that policy and procedure in place, but you didn't follow it. And so they're waiting for Hills to have an adequate response so that it doesn't happen again. And to this day, it hasn't happened.
It just seems like there's so many. I almost feel, Nicole, I feel like these guys are like the good old boys and they're like the wild, wild west, these companies, because for them to be getting away with so much. And like you were just saying, it doesn't just start at one point. It's throughout their whole system. It starts at the food end. Are they testing it when they receive it? Is it the right quality? Then as they're making it, are they tracking how they're making it in case something goes wrong? And they're not even doing that. And then when they're done with it, they're packaging and selling it, but they're not going for that final test, which seems to be like such an easy thing to do. It's like, why are they getting away with this?
Well, in Hills, and I'll say these because they're recent, right? So Hills, the case of Hills with the excess vitamin D, and then I will use Midwestern. So they got hit really hard with two. They had the aflatoxin recall at the end of last year, beginning of this year, and then they recently had the salmonella. And the reason why it was such a big deal for recalls of that magnitude to come out is because there are multiple instances where those things could have been caught. And if they're following their own quality and safety, food safety procedures, they should never happen, because something like corn or vitamin D, there are reports in industry and they're free. You can go online and grab them and they'll give you a mycotoxin report. So Midwestern or Earthborn or whatever you want to call them, should have known that there was a mycotoxin issue. And so they should have been, not only, as they should anyway, but they should have been testing that raw material as it was coming in, but they should have been testing it to a greater level. So like when those trucks come in with these huge trucks of corn, they should be testing that load in a variety of spots. So, all over, before it even gets inside that facility. So that's where that should have been caught. But if it didn't, for whatever reason, say there was just like a small, like baseball size spot of it, and that got missed, when it gets ground and put into that recipe, it should have been caught somewhere along that manufacturing line, because heat doesn't necessarily take care of that issue. And if it wasn't, which it should have been again, but if it wasn't, it should have been caught in the final product. So that tells me that there's a pervasive food safety culture issue at Midwestern Pet Food.
Well, it sounds like it's not just there, it's everywhere. When you really look at it, it's systemic throughout all the different companies, because it just seems like they're just at the point where they just don't care, it sounds like.
I wouldn't say all of them. I think that there are some manufacturers that really do a good job. And if I were to, Diane will probably fall over when she hears me say this, but I would say Royal Canin does a fantastic job when it comes to food safety. Do I think they could do better with their sourcing? Do I think that they could do better in a lot of things? Sure. But when it comes to their food safety and testing of inbound, during, and outbound ingredients, you don't see an issue with Royal Canin. Do I think there are better ways to feed your pet? Sure, but to each their own, right? Like I said in the beginning, there are there's different philosophies that everybody has, and there's different things that are important to different people, and I wholeheartedly respect that. I think another company that's more in our space that does a fantastic job, I've personally visited their facility and would have no problems eating off the floor, is Instinct Pet Food out of Lincoln, Nebraska. Granted, they do have some third-party manufacturers for, say, some of their cans, but those products are held to the same standard that anything made in their own facility is. So it really boils down to, again, the culture of the food safety of that particular company, as well as our.
We lost you.
Can I jump in?
Yeah. I was going to jump right. Hi.
Oh. I guess I was going to say, I think there's an aspect that's kind of being missed here, which is transportation. How is the food handled to get it to the retailer? I used to work for a company called W.A. Butler. I think they're Butler Shine now. And we used to get a lot of greased out products because of the shipper and it's one of the better known brands, very expensive food that it was veterinary diet, and they would just let it sit for days, and it's called greasing out.
Yep.
And they would let it sit for days on the side of the road. It would grease out, and there was one manufacturer that when I worked for Butler, there towards the end, we would sell their food, but we wouldn't even take it in our warehouses because it came in so infested with so many bugs that it was damaging Royal Canin and Purina. Because Royal Canin and Purina, they have their own trucks. And I do feed Purina, and that's the reason why. Because Purina takes responsibility for their own trucks. They don't let it sit on the side of the road, get infested with bugs, and grease out.
Yep.
So
I would agree with you that that's certainly a significant hole. I think it's different in different parts of the country for different distributors, for different retailers. I think that's a large but also significant variable. But yes, I would wholeheartedly agree with you. I think for some of the smaller brands, and this probably isn't true for all of them, but I think for some of the smaller brands, it's less of an issue because now the introduction of fresh.
We're losing you again, Nicole.
Those foods. Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I think, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I think you have, in some ways, it's probably better for some of the smaller manufacturers because you have the introduction of raw and fresh foods into the mix. And so obviously those have different requirements and different storage and, best by dates, if you will. So that could potentially speed up or at least put some different logistics into how different things are transported. But again, to your point, I think that that's definitely something that's often missed. And I know of distributors that, I will not or am very cautious about ordering certain things from because I know that, their storage isn't necessarily what it could be or should be. Distributors is something that I feel like that's a topic for a whole nother day, but distributor management and how they play into even selecting brands, quality brands, recalls, how they react, products that they bring in or push or what have you. I think that is certainly an area that could have significant influence on the industry, but many of them refuse to use their voice, if you will.
What is grease out or grease dump?
Yeah. So what happens is, from a nutritional level, what happens is that fat that's in that food, I don't care if it's plant-based, I don't care if it's animal-based. What happens is there's a variety of environmental factors that can cause that fat to become rancid. And so sometimes when that happens, the chemical reaction that takes place can essentially cause the outside of that bag to become greasy. And so the other thing that happens is that some of that can happen internally, and what you end up getting is just a disgusting moisture / grease situation, and that food just turns. It turns really quickly because of the heat and or moisture that it's exposed to, that it's really not meant to be exposed to.
Well, and I hear from you guys all the time, and Dana, you have an indie pet store as well, don't you?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So how often, do you see that this food does get to you? And by the time it gets to you, you guys, do you have to turn away a lot of food sometimes? Do you get to that point where you're like, no, we can't take this because it's been greased out, let's say?
I've been very fortunate because I guess maybe the brands that I'm carrying, I just haven't had that issue. The biggest issue I've had is, like torn bags. I had one distributor that was trying to deliver raw food that had obviously been melted. That distributor no longer does business with me because I fired them. But I've been very fortunate, but I do know others that have, especially, some of the big three foods, and like, I think she was saying, like, Kirsten was saying that Purina, sending it, through a different trucking service, they might have issues at some of the feed stores and things like that, more so than I've had in my store. Of course, I have more freezers than I do, dry food as well. So
let's back up. I was saying that I feed Purina. I feed Purina because Purina handles their own trucking.
Okay, sorry, I was thinking. So it was the Hills or whatever that was being shipped.
It's Heinz. They're the ones who had the problem with the grease out.
Got it. Okay, sorry, that was my misunderstanding. Yeah, that was my misunderstanding.
This was 20 years ago that I saw this happening, and Heinz was not allowed. We only drop shipped their food because it was coming in rancid, infested in bugs, and it was damaging the Hills and the Royal Canin and the Purina. So that's the reason that I feed Purina, is because of my experience with Heinz.
And
their food is nasty. It's terrible. I can't believe they're making a prescription diet, and they were letting it sit on the side of the road in Alabama and grease out. And then they were dropping it off at our, at the warehouses that we had. And it was but they had third-party trucking companies. So I get fussy. I want to know about who is actually transporting my dog's food.
Yeah.
So,
and that's largely going to depend on where you are in the country, or I would say the world, because there are some, I know Purina up near us, I don't carry it, but I know others that do, and I know that the distributors that do very well, and it often, at least up near us, is third party. But maybe near you, that's different. And, obviously times change, things change, economies change. There's obviously a ton of influences on that. But, I would say that that's an honest and reasonable concern for any brand of food. And I would call into question not just who's transporting, but like what's the length of time, what's the environmental condition that food is transported in, what's the warehouse like? Are you? Now with COVID, hopefully things are getting a little bit better. But is that, if you're in distribution or if you're in pet, are they willing to let you tour the warehouse? Will they share with you how often they turn products? Because if they have products sitting in their warehouse for 4 or 6 months, then maybe you don't want it. I wouldn't. So I think that that's a very valid concern. And I think distributors certainly deserve, and companies for that matter, deserve a lot more scrutiny on that front for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah, because I absolutely have started pushing my distributors as well with my questions that I want them to start asking the manufacturers, because, again, if we push from the bottom and we have WSAVA pushing from the top, and now we have the distributors asking some of these questions. Hey, this crazy lady down in San Antonio is driving us nuts with these questions. Would you answer her already? I think maybe we'd get a little bit further, because I think distributor involvement's really critical because, it falls back on them as well.
Well, and there's a whole timeline that they go by too. It's by the time, like you guys are talking about, the food arrives. Does it sit on the shelf too long? Is it expired potentially? Who knows? I do want to get back to WSAVA in the sense of, because all these big guys are getting away with all this stuff, and we see that there's so many new guys coming on board. Do you see that there's a pivot with the newer companies that they're really doing these tests?
No, and I wish my answer was different. I really wish my answer was different. I think this is going to make it easier, but I think that everybody, and I don't care what feeding philosophy you have, I think that everybody, consumers especially, but consumers, retailers, veterinarians, need to be asking these companies these questions. And I think it's important to come from a set or a place of, trying your best not to be biased. We all have our biases. But when somebody says I feed this particular food or I feed a certain way, your reaction should never be, oh my gosh, you feed raw, or oh my gosh, you feed Purina. It should never be that way. Instead, the whole point, at least me, Michael, having these conversations with you, and I know Ryan's reasons for having these conversations with you is to elevate the conversation, right?
Yep.
So it's never to push your particular feeding philosophy onto somebody else, but teaching them instead how to evaluate the safety and or quality of that particular product in the format that you want to or choose to feed. And if enough of us start to do that, I think with the silver lining to this whole, WSAVA guideline, if you will, is that we hopefully will be able to do that.
When you guys are looking, because you guys are independents and you take so much more care into selecting your product and all that, do you guys go to the big trade shows? Is there a different place that you go to research and find your vendors? How do you dig through all the vendors?
Yeah, so I personally, I probably won't be doing trade shows much anymore. But, in previous years when I've done trade shows, it's more been, to get face to face with people that are maybe not in my area or a little bit harder to reach. And then just to kind of get a pulse in the industry. So like I would walk the floor, I would usually get a badge from another company so that they didn't see it was mine, because everybody loved to kind of find me to sell me their product. So I'd get a badge from somebody else's company and I would walk around with it, turn around, just to kind of get a pulse on what was new, what people were buying, what trends, if you would, are out. And then I would go up to the companies that I did know or that did know me, and I would press them on really tough questions, or that would be my opportunity to kind of hold their feet to the fire, if you will, get with their VPs, their CEOs, their owners, their nutritionists, if they were there. And I would try and set up meetings prior to, and some of them would reach out to me, which was great. But I never use those trade shows as buying opportunities. But I was always obviously a little bit different, and had, different motives, if you will. Diana might be different. I don't know if she normally goes to some of those trade shows, but for me, those days are probably over.
Yeah.
Diana,
well, nope. I actually have never been to a trade show. Because I'm lucky enough to have a group of retailers and friends in the business all over the United States that will feed me information, on stuff that they do see at the trade shows. And I find that to be interesting because I get different takes from different people who have different levels of involvement and interest.
So how are you? So you find it through your friends, basically, all the new lines? Because you mentioned, I think you said that you have a lot of refrigerators inside of your store, which means you carry probably a lot of wet food, home cooked food, all those types of foods. Where do you?
Right. I have about 14, 15. Well, I also get the trade publications. A lot of times new products are mentioned in there. So I use some of the trade publications. A lot of the foods kind of migrate. They'll start in one region or one area, And so my friends in that area will say, hey, these guys are expanding. You might want to look at them. And so I'll take a look at the company and I'll watch and see what their growth looks like and, the type of food, the quality of food and things like that. But yeah, I have like 2 freezers right now with the cooked, and then I need 16, 14. I don't know. I've lost count of the freezers, but I have a lot of freezers full of the raw diets.
Beautiful. Wow. So see, there's so much, it takes so much information and so much knowledge to be here where we are today with you, Nicole and Diane. It's to understand all these different tests. And to me, it just seems so far-fetched that these big companies just don't do it. It just kills me that they don't do it. And, when I was looking at WSAVA website, like I was saying, they're in everything. They're in reproduction. They're in, kidney failure. They're in so many different areas. So they've got their hands in so much. Do you think they're too dispersed, or are they really tight with this organization and passing these rules and guidelines?
Well, I think just like every other, people kind of like to look at the veterinary field as vet, but here's the thing, right? Veterinarians are involved in human health. They're involved in epidemiology for humans and animals. They're involved in reproductive health. They're involved in food science for human and animals. They're involved in livestock nutrition. They're involved in livestock medicine, surgery, research, genetics. It's just all the same for companion animal. The veterinary field is such a wide field. So WSAVA really does serve a beautiful purpose in that they provide, guidance or kind of a central place for veterinarians of the world to kind of group, if you will. And just like anything else, you're always going to have people that agree, disagree. There's outliers. There's different philosophies. And, I think what's cool about WSAVA is you see a lot of different philosophies from different countries and, different walks of life. And there are different problems in different parts of the world, right? So we have unique challenges in our human and animal food supply here in the States that are different from other countries. So, they definitely do serve a purpose. I think, part of the struggle, and I'm not a veterinarian, I think one of the struggles watching this from a scientific perspective, and for those that don't know me, I have a master's in nutrition science, and I am a PhD student for canine nutrition and something called metabolomics, which is essentially a fancy way to say biochemistry. And we use biochemistry to study disease and nutrition. But I think one of the frustrating things from my perspective, and the people that are kind of in my corner, and it's a very small field, is that the WSAVA guidelines for nutrition are solely written from a veterinarian's perspective, and they're not taking into account those PhDs or other experts kind of from a different space, right? So they're looking at it simply from a veterinary medicine / veterinary nutrition perspective in a way that I would, for lack of a better way to say it, practice nutrition is going to be a little bit different because I have a different set of education and a different set of skills. And veterinary nutrition, if you will, they're just taught differently, and they're not necessarily taught how to formulate foods on a mass scale, or they're not necessarily taught how nutrition influences disease, and they can't be expected to. I'm not saying that in a negative light, but it's a long way for me to say there needs to be more people that are given a seat at the table, because some of the challenges that we have from a human health, a veterinary health, or in other words, a One Health perspective are not going to be solved unless we start offering other people seats at the table.
Well, one thing I do want to say is I don't think there's probably very, very few consumers, pet food consumers, that have the slightest clue what WSAVA is. Half of them barely know what AFCO is. But what I'm seeing over the last couple of years is the level of intelligence, the level of knowledge, the level of questioning is rising tremendously for the consumer. Because I have people coming in asking me really deep questions. They want to know, they have so many more questions now than they did, say, 5 years ago. I think it's a good thing. I think the internet had a lot to do with it. The Facebook, you have major influencers who are very popular. Karen Becker has 10 million followers. She puts out a lot of information. You have, like I said, other influencers like that are getting the word out, about different things. I also think that the pandemic over the last year, with people being, basically shut in, they're paying more attention to their animals. They're having more opportunity and time to read and to study some of these things. And I think that it has brought a new awareness to the consumer, and that we're going to see them starting to ask some of the same questions that we as retailers and the distributors and what are going to be asking as well. So that's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing a major shift in the consumer area of this as well.
Well, I can't agree with you more, Diana, is the fact that when I first got into Clubhouse, I thought, I'd play inside because I'm a designer here in Los Angeles. I'd play inside the design world and talk about design, blah, blah. And then I saw the dog world, and we have a product, Healthy Positive Labs. And so I thought I'd check out all the dog worlds. And then when I got here, I started to see that there was like this chain of people with this incredible knowledge, like Nicole, like yourself, Kirsten, everybody that I've been talking with in these rooms. And I've created these rooms where I have them weekly in these conversations. And there is a big pivot and a big change in how pet parents are treating their pets, and how they're really investigating what they're putting in their nutritional dish every day. What are they eating? There's a big shift in compared to like 20 years ago, compared to 10 years ago. And I think even compared to 5 now, even like you said, Diana, we see this so much inside the pandemic, where people had more time to really concentrate and study what was going on and how to raise a pet and a puppy the right way, what to feed, what not to feed, or who says what. And so by having these rooms and having these discussions like Nicole and I talk about, is to bring awareness to everybody. Our goal is never to shame anybody, like you should be doing this or you should be doing that. You're doing what you're doing because you're doing what you're doing, and that's beautiful. It's just, this is all about an awareness and education, an area that you could come to and just listen and learn. And that's what I love about Clubhouse. And Diana, I see these people all the time across the board coming into the rooms, and I get so many DMs afterwards. And that's why we created the Journey Pets on YouTube, is so that people can actually listen into previous rooms that they weren't able to, show up to. And I get that all the time. And so people have changed. The consumer has changed. They do want better food. They do want better ingredients. And you see that across the board. So with that, how do we make that happen, Nicole? How do we make that happen?
I think it boils down to consumers and retailers and veterinarians and just pet owners, pet lovers in general. Recognizing that there's not any one right answer, because everybody's always looking for the answer. And I always say there is not one, because every animal and every human is different. And then knowing that, diving in and recognizing that it's important for us to ask questions, the hard questions, and understand that, it takes a little bit of time and knowledge to kind of understand the industry. It's a very complex industry. Veterinary medicine is very complex. Veterinary nutrition is very complex. The science of nutrition is very complex, as well as the pet food and pet health industries are very complex. And so once I think you kind of understand those and know or recognize that you're never going to find the answer or the one right answer, it becomes a little bit easier. And it's, like you said, it's never shaming anybody into believing that any one diet philosophy is the right way. It's just elevating each other and having respect first and foremost for each other, that you can help just elevate the conversation. It's not about who's right and who's wrong. I hope that I never offend anybody in that sense, in saying like, oh, well, my philosophy or the way I feed my dogs is the right way. It's not about that. It's more just asking the right questions and making sure that we're feeding things that, again, regardless of food format, that companies that are doing their due diligence and following food safety protocol.
Well, and once again, thank you. You've got your little muscle belt on there, and I love it because you are a champ in what you're doing, and I really love your lead in what you're doing with every step that you're taking. That's
the coolest little award I've ever gotten. And for anybody that knows me, I'm like 5 foot tall. So when that belt came in the mail in the middle of the pandemic, that was kind of really neat.
I love it. I think it's adorable when I asked you about it. We did have someone with one more question. Let's see. Let's see if she comes up real quick before we close out the room. Yes. Hey, Bianca, how are you doing? We're just about to close out the room. What's your question?
Yes. Sorry, I raised my hand late.
We can't hear you.
That I raised my hand late because I had really bad connection, so I can't be able to. My question is, since there's new food guidelines about this, I have like a lot of customers saying that they want to switch their food because their vet told them to, and they're going to be switched. A lot of them were switched to prescription because of the whole DCM thing, even though the dog is completely healthy. Does that mean, as a retailer who works at a pet store, does that mean I'm going to be seeing less of those recommendations?
I don't think so, because most vets have no idea that those guidelines changed. We actually didn't even get wind of it until a couple weeks ago, myself. So I don't think vets really know. And even just based on ACVIN conference, which is like a major veterinary conference, just happened over the last week. Actually, we're still in today because I was sitting on some lectures. Even the veterinarians necessarily representing WSAVA and Hills and UC Davis or even Tufts, they were largely unaware of the guideline updates. So I don't think you're going to see that. I think you're going to see the same rhetoric for a while. If you're curious on it, Bianca, I don't know if you follow me, but if you do, you might want to check out my LinkedIn page because I just posted a variety of articles. There's an article from Dr. Yamka that is on pet food industry that I reviewed and helped with as well. There's actually a couple board certified veterinary nutritionists that helped with that article as well. You'll probably find that really interesting. And there's a variety of things. So feel free to hit up my LinkedIn. Anybody feel free to hit up my LinkedIn. I don't care. Some people get weird about that. I could care less. Enjoy, because there's a ton of content on there.
Yeah, there is.
Thank you so much. I will definitely check it out because I'm always interested in like learning what's new in the pet food industry. Is it okay for me to tell the customer about the new guidelines and that
absolutely
their vet should probably check it out? Yes.
Yeah, absolutely should. What I do is that article that's on pet food industry, I believe there's a link to print that out. If there's not, certainly just send me a direct message on LinkedIn, and I can get you a PDF copy. So what you can do is actually print that out for your customers. And what I've even done, granted, I work very closely with the veterinarians near me, so it's a little bit different. But I mean, you can always drop off copies of the new guidelines or copies of that article, or any of the articles that I have, Ryan has, industry has. We're happy to provide those. We put those out there publicly for a reason.
Thank you so much. I will definitely contact you. I just have to make sure I remember my password.
Yeah, no, you definitely.
No problem.
Yeah, you definitely want to check out Nicole, and want to check out Ryan. I've never heard him called Dr. Yumka before, Nicole. It's cute. I love it. Soon for you. With that, I'm going to go ahead and close out the room today. We had this incredible conversation as always. Thank you, Nicole, for being here and just sharing this wisdom and just, like we said, it's getting the message out there.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Definitely.
Thank you for all your insight.
Thank you.
Anytime.
Yeah, thank you, Diana, for being here as well, Bianca as well, and everybody else in the room for holding space with us tonight. Thank you for joining us. We will be back again next week for another Food for Thought, and who knows what the conversation's going to lead to. We always uncover something that's either cooking or spoiling, right, Nicole?
Always something.
Right. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm Michael. I'm your host today with Nicole, and we are out. Thank you. Have a beautiful weekend. Wow, what an intense conversation about WSAVA, food guideline for pets. And they're not even meeting them or even testing at some of the big companies. It's just crazy how much we have to push, how much we have to push, how much we have to push. But we'll keep pushing. Stay tuned for the next one. Thank you for joining me. I'm Michael, your host on The Journey. Please be sure to hit subscribe if you made it this far. You like what you've heard and you like what you're listening to. So become part of the family and hit the like button too while you're on your way out. Thanks.